Well, as of tonight, and this could change because things could take a dramatic turns for the worse at any moment, but as of tonight, President Joe Biden is managing the most successful American military evacuation from a war that America lost. As of tonight, the Biden administration and the American military have managed to evacuate 7,000 people from Afghanistan after the capital city of Kabul came under the control of the people who won the war. In Vietnam in 1975, after Saigon, then the capital city of South Vietnam, fell under the complete control of the North Vietnamese army, Republican President Gerald Ford was able to get absolutely no one out of Vietnam. No one. In those final days before the last American helicopter left Saigon, leaving thousands of our allies behind, the Ford administration and the American military were able to evacuate a total of 7,000 people. The Biden-run evacuation is well on its way to evacuating many more people than the American military was able to evacuate from Vietnam in the final days. In Vietnam, the Americans were being driven out of the country at gunpoint. In Afghanistan, so far, the Taliban have not fired a shot at the American military. In both desperate last-minute evacuations, the American military did its very best. The final days in both countries are filled with stories of American military heroism, but they are also demonstrations of the American military's continuing inability to invade a country, spend 20 years losing a war, and then evacuate in a way that meets with the approval of an American news media filled with people who think they know how to do what the American military has never been able to do. What you're not hearing in any of the critical analysis of how the Biden administration and the American military have handled the evacuation of Afghanistan is the example of who has done this sort of thing better. No one is telling you that the Russians did a much better job of invading Afghanistan, losing the war there, and then evacuating. No one is holding up the Russian evacuation of Afghanistan as the model. No one is holding up the evacuation of any defeated army from a foreign country as the model. And of course, no one is holding up the American evacuation of Vietnam as the model of how to do this, because the American evacuation of Vietnam was much, much worse in every way, by every measure. Every war produces a limitless flow of tragic individual stories. The end of every war produces a similar flow of tragic individual stories, but no individual story can tell you what your war policy should be or should have been. If this is your first experience with watching people left behind in war, then use it to decide whether you will support the next American war. But if you use it as an example of something you know how to do better than the American military, then you are making the mistake of believing that the madness of war can be managed. The American military does not know how to manage the madness of war. Catch-22 is a phrase that has entered our daily vocabulary to describe impossible situations. 60 years ago, Joseph Heller put that phrase in our vocabulary through the title of his war novel, Catch-22, which captures the clumsy and inefficient processes of the American military, which he experienced firsthand serving in World War II. Armies are not efficient machines. Armies are not run like automobile factories, as we discovered when the CEO of the Ford Motor Company became the Secretary of Defense during the Vietnam War. That organizational master, Robert McNamara, was lost in that job as any of the other secretaries of defense during the Vietnam War. The American military is a massive bureaucracy that does some things well. But the thing that it does not know how to do is the same thing that no military in the world knows how to do, and that is organize a dignified and honorable retreat and full evacuation from a war that we lost in a foreign country without leaving anyone behind. When someone tells you that the evacuation from Afghanistan could have been run better, ask them why that has never happened before in history. Ask them why this should be the very first time in history that a desperate last-minute military evacuation from a lost war should not be chaotic and messy. President Biden is now being criticized for saying he knew it would be chaotic. President Biden was a United States senator when he watched the chaotic exit from Vietnam. Of course he knew this was going to be chaotic. And of course he could not say that publicly before the chaos developed, because such a statement by the president would have immediately created the chaos. The American news media is very good at telling the tragic individual stories of war, and it is very good at forgetting those stories. So far, in all the tragic stories being presented to us about people struggling to get out of Afghanistan, people who deserve our full sympathy and support, there is no story quite like the story of two friends who were left behind in Vietnam. Gorgeous, gorgeous blue eyes, long eyelashes, of which I was very envious. That's how Darwin Judge's sister remembered him. Darwin Judge was a 19-year-old Lance Corporal in the Marine Corps from Marshalltown, Iowa, who spent less than 2 months in Vietnam before he was killed. He did not die alone. His 21-year-old Marine Corporal buddy, Charlie McMahon, from a suburb of Boston, was right beside him when they were both killed in a rocket attack. That was Charlie McMahon's 11th day in Vietnam. Charles McMahon and Darwin Judge became the answer to John Kerry's famous question in his Senate testimony as a Vietnam veteran against the war: how do you ask a man to be the last man to die for a mistake? It turns out there were two men, Charles McMahon and Darwin Judge, hit by the same rocket attack. They were in Vietnam to help manage the final desperate exit. They were there to protect the people trying to get on those final helicopters. They might have been on that final helicopter on April 30th, 1975, if they had lived just one more day. The day after Charlie McMahon and Darwin Judge were killed in action, the last American helicopter left Saigon and left their bodies behind in a hospital in Saigon. It was a mistake. It was the kind of mistake the American military can make in a situation like that. The American military did not just leave behind friendly interpreters in Vietnam. They did not just leave behind interpreters who helped reporters in Vietnam. They did not just leave behind many friendly allies in Vietnam who helped the American military and worked on American military bases. They also left behind hundreds of babies and children who were fathered by American soldiers over the 18 years of the American military involvement in Vietnam. And they left behind the last two men to die for the mistake of the Vietnam War. They left Charles McMahon and Darwin Judge behind. Massachusetts Senator Ted Kennedy went to work for his constituents, the McMahon family, and a year later he managed to secure the return of the bodies of Charles McMahon and Darwin Judge. Senator Kennedy never criticized President Ford for leaving them behind. Senator Kennedy never said he had a better idea about how to manage the evacuation of American troops and American allies from a war that we lost. The Democrats did not attack Republican President Gerald Ford for how he handled the exit from a war lost by Democratic and Republican presidents. The governor of Georgia, who was an Annapolis graduate and a Navy veteran, was running for president on the day that the last American helicopter left Vietnam, and he did not criticize how Republican President Gerald Ford managed that evacuation, because Jimmy Carter knew that the military was doing its best. Jimmy Carter knew there was no good version of an evacuation from a lost war. No one was surprised by the chaos and the dishonor of the American final exit from Vietnam. The world was not surprised. Every day of the Vietnam War was chaos, including the final day. Just a year after the evacuation from Vietnam, at the Democratic National Convention, in his acceptance speech for his presidential nomination, Jimmy Carter said this:
I've never had more faith in America than I do today. We have an America that, in Bob Dylan's phrase, is busy being born, not busy dying.
In that speech, Jimmy Carter did not criticize Gerald Ford's management of the American evacuation from Vietnam. None of the anti-war protesters who had been demanding an immediate withdrawal from Vietnam for over 10 years attacked Gerald Ford's management of the final withdrawal from Vietnam. No one in the anti-war movement, including the Vietnam veterans, believed that they had a better idea about how to evacuate a lost war, or that the American military was capable of doing a better job of evacuating from a war that they lost. The lesson of the Vietnam War and the war in Afghanistan, including the last days of those wars, is not that we have to teach West Point classes of future generals how to safely and honorably evacuate from our lost wars without leaving anyone behind. The lesson for a country that has not won a war since 1945 is stop launching wars of dubious legality and unclear moral purpose that we do not know how to win. The people who own the American exit from the Afghanistan war are the people who advocated launching that war, and more importantly, the people who never learned, the people who never stopped advocating for continuing that war.